Hello everybody, welcome to another music theory video. This is David Farrell. Today's video continues from our previous one on modulation. In this video we're going to talk about some different techniques that go along with modulation. We'll be talking about direct modulation, sequences, single line modulations, all these lovely things. And so let's get to our video so we can understand some new ways we can move from one key to another key. Let's go. A quick recap from before. Modulation, we're talking about a musical shift to a new tonal center. We're changing what that tonal center of our music is from one key to a different key. And typically, this is a long and sustained change. Otherwise, we would call it a tonicization, just a brief borrowing from a new key area. In our previous video, I talked about common chord modulation, which uses a chord that is common to the two keys as a transition from one to the other, this common chord, or the pivot chord as we sometimes call it. And common chord modulation allows us to move smoothly between these keys by taking something that belongs to both of them and helping it become the transition. In the techniques we see today, we'll see some modulation techniques that are similar to this and some that are different for this. And of course, in case you've forgotten, there's a whole video about common chord modulation and in modulation in general. If you need to go watch that again, you can do that at any time. The first techniques I want to talk about with regard to modulation are what I'm calling single line techniques. These methods are similar to common chord modulations. They have a transitional or pivoting section. They have a section of music that is a little bit ambiguous, that helps us transition smoothly from one key area, our original key, to the second key area, our new key. Okay? These are smooth transitional methods. They have, similar to the common chord, they have a little area where it feels like we're a little bit in between keys before we land in our new key. But these techniques don't use a chord. They don't use a common chord or a pivot chord, otherwise they'd just be common chord modulations. They occur over either an unaccompanied line, which we'll call a monophonic modulation, or a single unharmonized pitch, which we call a common tone modulation. By using a single pitch or an unaccompanied line, we lose a sense of harmony in the music. We lose a sense of chords for a little while. And when we lose that sense of chords, we have a little bit of trouble telling exactly where we are in a key area. And these modulation techniques take advantage of that to push us into a new key area. Let's look at some short examples to see what these look like and sound like. Our first example here is a common tone modulation. We start clearly in the key of G major with a strong cadence. And then the modulation begins to occur when the texture clears away to a single note. In this case, the pitch is a G. You can see it in the third measure here. All the other pitches go away, and we lose a sense of harmony because all we have is just one note, and we know we can't make a chord out of just one note. During that time, the common tone is silently reinterpreted. In this case, it moves from being the tonic of the original key to being the mediant of a new key. And here E flat major is the new key I've chosen. You can see that I've labeled this similar to the way I label common chords, but instead I've labeled it via its scale degree. G was scale degree 1 in our old key of G major. It is now scale degree 3 in our new key of E flat major. And when the chords come in, they pretend as if we've been in E flat major all the time, and we now get a new cadence, a 1-5-1, in that new key of E flat. Let's listen to what this sounds like. Complete with a lovely suspension over the 5-7 in the key of E flat. This is just one version of a common tone modulation. Okay, we can interpret any scale degree as a different scale degree in a new key, and this technique makes it easier to move to foreign keys since it does not require a shared diatonic chord between the original and new keys, like our common chord modulations do. Common tone can allow us to move very, very far away from our original key area. So this is what we're looking at when we look for common tone modulation. We're looking for this reduction in texture to a single pitch And in that time, when we're missing chords, the texture becomes ambiguous. The harmony becomes ambiguous. We're not sure where we are. And the music takes advantage of that to push us to a new key area. Very similar to pivot chord modulations, where we have an ambiguous chord that pushes us towards a new key. Let's look at something similar. The principle behind a monophonic modulation is the same as the principle behind a common tone modulation. We have an unharmonized line, a single unaccompanied line that transitions us between keys. Monophonic modulation will use a more complex line, a moving line, rather than a single tone like our common tone modulation, but the principle is the same. We lose track of the harmony because we only have one line playing at a time, and in that period where we do not have harmonization, the music allows itself to be reoriented into a new key. Like our common tone modulations, this allows us to shift a little bit more easily between foreign keys. Let's take a listen to another simple example. This example starts in the key of D, and then again in the third measure, we lose all of our harmony, our accompanimental line drops away, and our melodic line winds around and pushes us outside of the key of D major and into our new key of F sharp minor. Let's hear what it sounds like. Monophonic modulation, very similar to what we just saw in common tone modulation. We have an unharmonized moment where things become a little unclear, a little bit ambiguous. And we take advantage of that by letting us use that ambiguity to allow us to move to a new key area. This monophonic modulation happens between D major and F sharp minor, and it seems pretty smooth. It's a pretty easy way to move between keys. Let's talk about a completely different way now that we can modulate from one key area to another key area. So, as we've said, both the common chord, the common tone, and the monophonic modulations take advantage of something musically ambiguous to allow us to have a smooth transition between one key and another. Our next method, called the direct modulation, is very, very different. There is nothing ambiguous or subtle about the direct modulation. There is no ambiguous section. There's no transitional moment between our key areas. Instead, we simply move directly into a new key. We simply stop being in one key and start being in another key. And this can be quite surprising. This is something that is taken advantage of when it's used to sort of shock the listener, to say, oh wow, I thought I was in one key and now I am in another key. The example I have does something very common, which is to use a direct modulation between phrases. And so if we take a quick look at our phrase, we can see we have a phrase that is in the key of D major, and it moves between 1 and 5 in that key of D major, and there's a nice cadence at the end. And then when we begin our second line, we start in F sharp minor once again. We start in F sharp minor. There's no common tone. There's no monophonic line that connects the two. There's no common chord. We ended on a D major triad, and that triad is not functioning in our new key. That's not like it functioned as a 6 chord to sort of help smooth us over. We simply stopped in one and started in the new key. Let's take a listen and hear how this direct modulation sounds. Here, the direct modulation helps heighten the difference between these two phrases. They have very different melodic profiles, and so the change in harmony in between phrases really helps to reinforce this. We'll see direct modulations doing work like this a lot between phrases, though sometimes we can see them in the middle of a phrase as well. Again, the direct modulation, a little bit different from what we've been looking at, and purposefully so. No transition, no ambiguous harmonic moment, just a direct move from one key to a new key. I have one last thing I'd like to talk about in today's sort of potpourri of different modulation ideas, and that's the use of sequence in modulation. We remember that sequence is a harmonic or melodic pattern that is repeated at different pitch levels. We've seen sequences for a while now in all of our different diatonic musics, and they're relatively common. Sequences can be used to override expected tonal patterns, which is a nice thing. That's already typical. Sometimes we see chords resolve in a little bit of an unusual way, but this is because the pattern of the sequence can take over the typical tonal resolutions. And this repetition that can override harmonic expectations can also be used to help us move music into new areas, new key areas. Sequences can often be used to help make common chord modulations or direct modulations more smooth. When we look at a sequence, oftentimes sequences and modulations are used in combination with some of these techniques. If we look at what we see here, we have a sequence that's used to enhance some direct modulations. We start our excerpt in D minor, and we move directly to E minor, and then directly to F minor. But what helps this sound typical, which helps this not sound too crazy, is the fact that we're repeating similar harmonic and melodic ideas every time. The first two measures are repeated, sequenced up a step in the key of E minor. And then the fourth measure is also repeated, sequenced up a step from E minor to F minor. And so these direct modulations, these surprising modulations, are made a little bit smoother and more palatable to our ear by the sequential repetition that's happening. Use of sequence in modulation is really important. It really helps us understand music as listeners. And so as we look at modulations, we want to have our eyes open for these sorts of patterns, and our ears open, I guess. Let's take a listen. There are no common chords happening here. The modulations are a little bit too distant for that, but the repeated motivic ideas and the repeated chord progressions give this example a sense of unity that they would not have without the sequences. What about sequences in a common chord modulation? Let's take a look. Here we have something that can be analyzed as a typical common chord modulation from our key of C major to the key of F major. We can see later on in the chord progression, I've used 6 as a common chord, 6 from my key of C major as 3 in my key of F major, and then finish with my cadence of 4, 5, 1. But how I get here is just as important. In this case, I arrive at this common chord modulation after a long harmonic sequence. Starting in the second measure, I started descending perfect fifth sequence, a circle of fifths sequence. 5, going down a perfect fifth to 1, going down a perfect fifth to 4, going down a perfect fifth to 7, going down a perfect fifth to 3, going down a perfect fifth to 6. And this patterning does help simulate the ambiguity that we get from a common chord modulation in general. We start to lose track of where our initial key might have been because of all the sequential motion, all the pattern motion. This becomes more important to our ear than tonal function. And this is especially clear because our 7 chord resolves to 3 rather than resolving to 1. And so when we finally break out of the sequence, we have a little bit of wiggle room to break out of the sequence and land, in some ways, in a new place. And in this case, we do. We land in the key of F major. Okay? So I'm analyzing this as a common chord modulation. It does fit the bill for that. But the fact that we used a sequence to get through this modulation is just as important to how we understand this passage of music. And so I don't want to ignore that element as well. Let's take a listen. The sequence allows us to move much more smoothly from one key to the other. The repeated pattern, in this case again, that circle of fifths pattern, helps us get away from the strong harmonic sense of C major, and that allows us to sort of slide very smoothly into the new key of F major. Sequences, very useful in modulation, useful in helping smooth out direct modulations and common chord modulations, And so as we listen to more music and analyze more music, we'll keep our ears open for these sorts of patterns. That's it for today's video. Today we talked about different modulation techniques. We talked about single line techniques like the common tone and the monophonic modulation. Very similar to our common chord modulations in that they use ambiguity to help transition smoothly from one key to another. We talked about direct modulations, which are the complete opposite, modulations where we just slam from one key right into another key. And then we talked about sequence and how we can use sequence alongside of some of these techniques to really help hold things together and make the music sound cohesive. We'll be looking for all of these in our analysis, and we'll be trying to incorporate them into our own writing. If you have questions, do not hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for watching.